For 3 long years. Elena Hart believed the past had finally stopped chasing her. She had changed cities, changed her phone number, changed her name, and every single night before closing her small flower shop, she whispered the same prayer. Not for money, not for success, not even for love, just peace. But peace had always been a luxury life refused to give her. And on an ordinary Thursday afternoon, while arranging white lilies near the front window, Elena froze. Across the street stood a black car. Not just any car. A car she recognized instantly. Her hands began to tremble. The flowers slipped from her fingers. Because standing beside that car was a man she had spent 3 years trying to forget. The man the world feared. The man newspapers called a ghost. The man who once ruled half the criminal underworld. And the man who had shattered her heart before disappearing from her life. Adrian Moretti, the Mafia boss she thought she would never see again. He hadn't changed. Still dressed in black. Still carrying that terrifying calm that made powerful men nervous. Still looking at her as though no amount of time had erased her existence. But there was something different. Something strange. Pain. Real pain. And when their eyes met after 3 years apart, Elena realized something that terrified her more than seeing him again. He had never stopped looking for her, and she had no idea why. But the answer waiting for her would change everything. Because Adrian Moretti wasn't back to destroy her life. He was back to save it. And the truth behind his disappearance was far darker than Elena could ever imagine. Long before fear entered her life, Elena Hart had been the kind of woman who smiled at strangers. She wasn't rich. She wasn't famous. And she certainly wasn't lucky. But she possessed something far more beautiful. Hope. Growing up in a tiny apartment with her widowed mother, Elena had learned early that dreams cost money. And money was something they never seemed to have enough of. Still, hardship never stole her kindness. While other children complained about what they lacked, Elena found joy in simple things. Books, music, fresh flowers, sunsets, and the dream of one day opening her own flower shop. People often underestimated her. Her gentle personality made others mistake kindness for weakness. But beneath those warm brown eyes lived a woman stronger than she realized. After losing her mother at 22, Elena faced the world completely alone. The funeral bills consumed nearly everything. Friends slowly disappeared. Promises faded. And loneliness became her closest companion. Yet somehow, she kept moving forward. During the day, she worked 2 jobs. At night, she attended business classes. And every spare dollar went into a secret savings account. Years passed. Slowly. Painfully. But dreams have strange ways of surviving. At 27, Elena finally opened a tiny flower shop. It wasn't luxurious. It wasn't perfect. But it was hers. For the first time in years, happiness returned. Customers loved her. Children stopped by after school. Elderly couples became regular visitors. Life was peaceful, simple, beautiful. And perhaps that was why fate decided to intervene. Because destiny often arrives when least expected. And Elena's destiny walked into her shop on a cold winter evening. Not with roses, not with romance, but with blood on his hands. The bell above the door rang softly. Elena looked up from arranging tulips and immediately knew something was wrong. The man standing there wasn't ordinary. Tall, broad shoulders, dark hair, a perfectly tailored black suit. But it wasn't his appearance that caught her attention. It was his eyes. Cold, sharp, and exhausted. Behind him stood 4 men. Equally intimidating. All silent. All watching. The atmosphere inside the shop changed instantly. Customers hurried out. An elderly woman grabbed her purse. Even the room itself seemed to hold its breath. Elena swallowed nervously. "Can I help you?" she asked. The stranger looked around the store. Then his eyes stopped on a bouquet of white roses. "For a funeral," he said quietly. His voice surprised her. Deep, calm, but carrying sadness far older than his years. Without asking questions, Elena prepared the flowers. She noticed blood on his sleeve. Not much, but enough. Fear whispered inside her mind. Leave. Run. Call someone. Yet something else caught her attention. His hands. They trembled. Not with anger. With grief. After handing him the bouquet, Elena carefully spoke. "Who passed away?" The bodyguards exchanged uneasy glances. But the stranger answered, "My mother." And suddenly, something changed. His eyes softened. Only slightly. But enough. Elena recognized that pain. Because she had lived it. "I'm sorry," she whispered. No fear. No judgment, just compassion. For several seconds, the man stared at her, as though no one had spoken to him like that in years. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled. A small smile, but genuine. Thank you. And with that, he left. Elena thought she would never see him again. She couldn't have been more wrong. Because 2 days later, he returned. And then again, and again, always buying flowers. Always quiet. Always leaving before saying too much. Until one evening, curiosity finally overcame her. Are there really this many funerals? She asked playfully. For the first time, the mysterious man laughed. And the sound surprised everyone, including him. No. Then who are the flowers for? A shadow crossed his face. Then he answered softly. People who deserve to know they're loved. Elena smiled. That's beautiful. But outside the shop, hidden inside a parked car, two men watched the scene with horror. Because they knew something Elena didn't. The man she was laughing with wasn't just another customer. He was Adrian Moretti, the most feared Mafia boss in Europe. And if enemies discovered he cared about a woman, Elena Hart's life would never be safe again. Love doesn't always arrive with fireworks. Sometimes it appears quietly, like music playing softly in the distance. Weeks became months. And somehow, Adrian Moretti became part of Elena's daily life. He never spoke much, but he listened, really listened. When she talked about flowers, he listened. When she shared stories about her mother, he listened. When she spoke about dreams and fears, he remembered every word. And little by little, Elena began seeing the man hidden behind the rumors. Not the monster newspapers described, not the feared king of the underworld, but a lonely man, a broken man, a man carrying invisible scars. She noticed how he secretly paid hospital bills for strangers, how children adored him, how old women blessed him, how he spent more time helping others than helping himself. And slowly, danger transformed into trust. Trust transformed into friendship. And friendship transformed into something neither of them expected. Something beautiful, something terrifying, something that would eventually destroy them both. Because enemies were watching. And in Adrian Moretti's world, love was never a blessing. It was a weakness. And someone had already decided Elena Hart would become the price he paid. Little did she know, her nightmare was only beginning. Elena never intended to fall in love with a dangerous man. In truth, she never intended to fall in love again. Loss had taught her to be careful. Pain had taught her to protect herself. And loneliness had taught her not to expect miracles. Yet Adrian Moretti entered her life the way the sunrise enters a dark room. Slowly, quietly, without permission. By spring, the flower shop had become more than a business. It had become the place where two lonely souls forgot the world outside. Sometimes Adrian arrived late in the evening. Sometimes early in the morning. Always carrying the same calm expression. Always asking about her day. And always leaving with flowers. One day, Elena finally laughed. At this point, half the city's flowers belong to you. Adrian smiled. The other half belongs to you. She shook her head. No, they belong to customers. No, he answered softly. They belong to the woman who brought color back into life. Those words stayed with her. Because nobody had ever spoken to her that way. Nobody had ever looked at her as though she mattered. Not completely. Not like this. And perhaps that was what frightened her most. Because Adrian wasn't just changing her life. He was becoming part of it. Still, there were shadows. Late-night phone calls. Sudden disappearances. Bodyguards waiting outside. Bruises hidden beneath expensive suits. Questions without answers. And every time Elena tried to understand, Adrian would simply smile. Some worlds are better left untouched. But Elena wasn't afraid of difficult truths. She had survived grief. She had survived poverty. She had survived abandonment. Surely, she could survive secrets. At least, that's what she believed. Until the night she accidentally discovered who Adrian Moretti really was. And the truth nearly shattered everything. It happened by accident. One ordinary evening. One wrong turn. One moment that changed everything. Elena had forgotten her phone inside the flower shop. By the time she returned, darkness had covered the streets. She expected silence. Instead, she heard shouting. Terrified, she froze near the entrance. Inside the shop stood Adrian. But he wasn't alone. Several men surrounded him. And for the first time since meeting him, Elena saw a different side of the man she loved. His voice was cold. His eyes carried authority. And the room itself seemed to obey him. No one touches innocent people, Adrian said. The threat in his tone made grown men lower their heads. One of them nodded nervously. "It won't happen again, boss." Boss. The word echoed inside her mind. Then she heard another name. Moretti. Adrian Moretti. Suddenly everything made sense. The black cars. The bodyguards. The fear in people's eyes. The rumors. The headlines she had ignored. And the stories everyone whispered. The king of the underworld. The most feared man in Europe. Her legs nearly gave out beneath her. A flower vase slipped from her hands. The sound echoed. Adrian turned. And the moment he saw her standing there, his face changed completely. Not anger. Not rage. Fear. For the first time since meeting him, Adrian Moretti looked terrified. Not because enemies had found him. Not because betrayal surrounded him. But because Elena had seen the truth. "Elena," he whispered. Tears filled her eyes. "No." Her voice trembled. "No, tell me they're wrong." He said nothing, and silence became the answer. She stepped backward. "Tell me they're lying." Still nothing. The truth stood between them. Terrifying, unavoidable, and heartbreakingly real. Without another word, Elena ran. Because the man she loved was the one man she had promised herself never to trust. And Adrian stood there, unable to follow. Because despite all his power, he knew one thing. Love could never be forced. For 2 weeks, Elena disappeared. She stopped answering calls, closed the flower shop, and ignored every message. Friends worried. Customers asked questions. But nobody knew the truth. She spent those days fighting herself. Because her heart and mind were at war. Her mind remembered the stories. Violence, crime, fear, everything society had taught her to hate. But her heart remembered something else. A man who listened. A man who remembered her favorite songs. A man who secretly donated money to orphanages. A man who stayed awake beside hospital beds. A man who carried grief behind his eyes. Which one was real? The monster? Or the man she loved? Perhaps both. And that terrified her. One evening, unable to endure the confusion, Elena returned to the flower shop. The lights were off, but something unexpected waited outside. Hundreds of flowers. Roses, tulips, lilies, daisies. Every flower she had ever mentioned loving, covering the sidewalk. And among them sat a letter. No threats, no explanations, no demands. Only 6 words. "If goodbye brings peace, goodbye." She read it twice, then 3 times. And suddenly tears streamed down her face. Because Adrian hadn't tried to control her. He hadn't sent bodyguards. He hadn't forced anything. He had simply let her go. And somehow, that hurt more. But destiny wasn't finished with them. Because danger had already noticed Elena. And someone else wanted Adrian Moretti to suffer. Love creates enemies. And powerful men create monsters. Viktor Sokolov understood that better than anyone. For years, he had dreamed of destroying Adrian Moretti. But Adrian himself had proven impossible to defeat. So Viktor searched for weakness. And eventually, he found Elena. To Viktor, she was merely a target. A tool. A way to make a king bleed. But he underestimated something. He underestimated her. One evening, while closing the shop, Elena sensed something wrong. A black van. Unknown faces. Cold eyes. Instinct screamed danger. Before fear could consume her, several men approached. And then, chaos erupted. Tires screeched. Gunshots echoed. Bodyguards appeared from nowhere. Men fell. People screamed. And standing in the middle of the nightmare was Adrian. His suit stained with blood. His expression colder than death itself. He moved with terrifying precision. Not for revenge. Not for pride. But for one reason. Her. Elena. When everything ended, she found herself trembling inside his arms. Safe. Alive. And Adrian. Adrian looked completely broken. His hands shook. His breathing faltered. As though the thought of losing her had destroyed something inside him. "You stayed away," she whispered through tears. His voice cracked. "Because happiness matters more than love." Those words shattered her. Because in that moment, Elena understood something profound. This man had spent weeks suffering alone. Not because he stopped loving her, but because he loved her enough to let her leave. And perhaps that was why she finally stopped running. But destiny had prepared an even crueler test. Because before the year ended, everything they built would be torn apart, and Elena Hart would lose the man she loved. Or so she believed. It was supposed to be a celebration. Their first anniversary. Nothing extravagant. Just dinner, music, and the promise of tomorrow. For the first time in years, Elena allowed herself to dream again. Marriage, children, a family, simple things, beautiful things. And Adrian? He smiled more, laughed more. He even talked about leaving his dangerous empire behind, something nobody thought possible. But happiness can make powerful enemies desperate, and desperate enemies become dangerous. That night, Adrian kissed Elena goodbye. 30 minutes, he promised. Don't order dessert without me. She laughed. I'll try. Neither of them knew. Those would be the last words they would share for 3 years. Because 30 minutes later, explosions shook the city. Cars burned. Sirens screamed. And Adrian Moretti vanished. Without a trace. No body. No answers. No goodbye. Only silence. And for Elena Hart, silence became a prison. One that would haunt her for years. But unknown to everyone, Adrian Moretti wasn't dead. And the reason he disappeared would break hearts all over again. People often believed heartbreak happened in a single moment. They imagined dramatic goodbyes, tears, screams, final words. But for Elena Hart, heartbreak arrived differently. It arrived in silence. A silence that stretched into days. Days that became months. And months that eventually became years. At first, she refused to believe Adrian was gone. Every morning, she checked the news. Every evening, she answered unknown numbers. Every night, she stared at the door, expecting him to walk inside with that familiar smile. But time is cruel. And eventually, hope begins to feel like punishment. The world declared Adrian Moretti dead. Authorities closed investigations. New criminal organizations rose to power. Even his enemies stopped searching. Everyone moved on. Everyone except Elena. Because moving on wasn't as simple as people imagined. How could someone forget the person who taught them how to live again? How could someone erase memories that lived inside every corner of the heart? Still, life demanded survival. And Elena had survived worse. So she buried her grief. Not because she stopped loving him, but because she had no choice. Months later, she moved away. Far from memories. Far from reporters. Far from the city that reminded her of everything she had lost. And in a quiet town by the sea, she started over. Once again, just as she had after losing her mother. Just as she had after every heartbreak life had thrown her way. She opened another flower shop. Smaller, simpler, peaceful. Customers loved her gentle spirit. Children visited after school. Old couples shared stories while buying roses. And although sadness remained hidden behind her smile, Elena slowly learned to breathe again. Not perfectly, but enough. People often asked why she never married. Why she always avoided dates. Why she seemed distant whenever conversations turned toward love. She always smiled politely. But nobody knew. Nobody knew that part of her heart still belonged to a man buried only by memories. Or so she believed. Because thousands of miles away, a man she thought was dead was fighting a battle far worse than death itself. Adrian Moretti had spent 3 years in darkness. Not by choice. And certainly not in peace. The explosion that changed everything had not killed him. But it had nearly destroyed him. His enemies had planned carefully. And when Adrian survived, they made sure he disappeared. 3 years. 3 years stolen from his life. 3 years separated from the woman he loved. 3 years enduring pain that would have broken most men. But one thought kept him alive. Elena. Her laughter. Her voice. The way she arranged flowers. The dreams she spoke about beneath the evening sun. And every time despair whispered surrender. Her memory became his reason to survive. Eventually, fate offered him freedom. And Adrian returned. Not as a king. Not as a conqueror. Not seeking revenge. He returned as a man with one purpose. To see her. Just once. Even if she hated him. Even if she had moved on. Even if another man stood beside her. He only needed to know one thing. Was she happy? Because happiness mattered more than love. The same truth that had broken his heart years ago. And that was why, standing across the street from her flower shop after 3 years, Adrian almost turned around. Because the woman arranging white lilies looked peaceful, beautiful, stronger, and perhaps free. Maybe his return would only reopen old wounds. Maybe she deserved better. Maybe she deserved a normal life. But destiny had other plans. Because before Adrian could leave, Elena looked up, and their eyes met. 3 years. Countless tears. 1,000 unanswered questions. And suddenly, time stopped. Neither of them moved. Neither of them breathed. Because some moments are too powerful for words. Elena stood frozen. The flowers slipped from her hands, and her heart began racing so violently it hurt. No, impossible. It couldn't be him. She had buried him, mourned him, cried for him, loved him, and now he stood there, alive. The world around them disappeared. Cars passed. People walked. Life continued. But for Elena Hart, everything had stopped. Adrian slowly crossed the street. Not like a king, not like a feared mafia boss, but like a man approaching the most important person in his world. When he finally stood before her, he spoke softly. "Hello, sunshine." The nickname, the voice, the smile. And suddenly, the walls she had spent 3 years building shattered. Tears flooded her eyes. Then anger. Then disbelief. And before anyone could react, slap. The sound echoed across the street. Passers-by turned. But Adrian didn't move, didn't complain, didn't defend himself. Because after 3 years of silence, he knew she deserved that. And much more. Elena's voice trembled. 3 years. Another tear escaped. 3 years. Then she hit his chest. Not with hatred, but with pain. 3 years. And for the first time in anyone's memory, Adrian Moretti cried. Real tears. Not because she struck him, not because she shouted, but because after 3 years, he could finally hear her voice again. And somehow, that miracle hurt and healed him at the same time. But their reunion would not be easy, because time changes people, and love alone cannot erase scars. Forgiveness didn't arrive overnight. It arrived slowly, painfully, like sunlight after a long winter. Elena listened to Adrian's story, and with every truth revealed, her heart broke all over again. The explosion, his disappearance, the years stolen from him, the suffering, the loneliness, and above all, his greatest fear, that she would spend her life waiting for someone who might never return. So he had stayed away, until fate gave him no choice. But although understanding returned, trust did not. Not immediately, because pain leaves shadows, and shadows do not disappear easily. There were awkward moments, silent dinners, unspoken fears, sleepless nights. Sometimes Elena woke up terrified, afraid he would vanish again, afraid she would lose him once more. And Adrian noticed. He always noticed. One evening, while watching the sunset together, Elena finally whispered the question that haunted her. What if tomorrow disappears again? Adrian looked toward the ocean, then answered quietly. Then every tomorrow before that will be spent loving you. Those words stayed with her, because they weren't promises. Life had already taught them promises could break. Instead, they were choices. And every day afterward, Adrian chose her. Not perfectly, not dramatically, but faithfully. And slowly, the wounds began healing. Yet danger had not completely disappeared, because ghosts from Adrian's past had survived. And one final enemy still waited in the shadows. A man consumed by revenge. A man who believed love was weakness. And he planned to prove it. Even if Elena Hart had to die, Viktor Sokolov had waited years. Years to destroy Adrian Moretti. Years to watch him suffer. And when news of his return spread, Viktor smiled. Because now there was something Adrian loved. Something precious. Something vulnerable. Elena. But Viktor made one mistake. He still believed Elena was the same woman she had been years earlier. He remembered a kind florist. A gentle dreamer. A woman who cried easily. What he didn't know was that grief changes people. Heartbreak changes people. And surviving changes people. Because Elena Hart was no longer the girl who waited for rescue. She had become something stronger. A woman who had rebuilt her life from ashes more than once. And when Viktor finally tried to use her, he discovered the truth. Elena wasn't afraid, because fear had lost its power over her years ago. When danger surrounded her one final time, she didn't break. She fought, not with violence, but with courage, with intelligence, with unwavering love. And standing beside her, Adrian realized something extraordinary. He had spent years protecting her, without understanding that she had been saving him all along. Because Elena had accomplished something no enemy ever could. She had taught the feared Mafia king how to become a better man. And perhaps that was her greatest strength. But fate still had one final surprise waiting. One that neither of them saw coming. And it would change their lives forever. For most of her life, Elena Hart had never asked for extraordinary things. She didn't dream of mansions. She didn't dream of luxury. And she certainly never imagined herself standing beside one of the most feared men in the world. Her dreams had always been simple. A peaceful home, a family, a life filled with love instead of loneliness. But simple dreams often become the hardest to achieve, especially for people who have spent their lives losing the ones they love. After Viktor Sokolov's final defeat, the darkness that had haunted Adrian for years slowly began to fade. Not completely. Scars never truly disappear. But for the first time in decades, Adrian Moretti stopped living like a man preparing for war. He began living like a man preparing for tomorrow. And Elena noticed. The bodyguards became fewer. The phone calls became quieter. The shadows around him no longer seemed so heavy. And one evening, while closing the flower shop together, she caught him smiling to himself. Not his usual smile. Not the polite smile he showed strangers. But the smile of someone who had finally found peace. "What is it?" she asked. Adrian simply looked at her. And for several seconds, he said nothing. Then he smiled softly. Nothing. But his eyes betrayed him. Something was different. Something had changed. And Elena would soon discover exactly what. Because Adrian Moretti had spent months planning something. Something that terrified him more than facing enemies. Something that made his hands shake. Something no amount of power could prepare him for. He wanted to ask Elena Hart to marry him. People feared Adrian Moretti. Politicians feared him. Enemies feared him. Entire organizations feared him. But one tiny velvet box hidden inside his pocket reduced the mighty king of the underworld into a nervous man who barely remembered how to breathe. And his bodyguards found the situation amusing. Because watching Adrian Moretti panic over a marriage proposal felt almost unbelievable. For weeks, he changed his plans. Too fancy, too simple, too dramatic. Nothing felt right. Because Elena had never cared about expensive things. She cared about moments, memories, feelings. And eventually, Adrian realized something. The answer had been with him from the beginning. Flowers. On a warm evening, he invited Elena to the shop after closing hours. Confused, she unlocked the door and stopped. The entire room glowed softly beneath hundreds of candles. Thousands of flowers filled every corner. White lilies, sunflowers, tulips, roses, every flower she had ever loved. Tears instantly appeared in her eyes. But before she could speak, Adrian stepped forward. And something strange happened. The powerful man who commanded armies of loyal men suddenly looked terrified. His voice trembled. His hands shook. And Elena almost laughed through her tears. Because after everything they had survived, after bullets, explosions, heartbreak, and 3 years of separation, it was a proposal that frightened him most. "Sunshine," he whispered. His voice cracked, and for a moment, words abandoned him. Then he smiled helplessly. "I had a speech." Elena laughed, and that laugh was enough to calm him. So he simply spoke from the heart. No promises about forever. No promises that life will always be easy. No promises that tomorrow will be perfect. His eyes filled with emotion. But every tomorrow will belong to you. And slowly, Adrian Moretti knelt. Not like a king. Not like a feared mafia boss. But like a man completely in love. "Will you marry me?" By then, Elena was already crying. Not because of the ring. Not because of the flowers. But because fate had given her something she thought she had lost forever. Hope. And smiling through tears, she whispered the word that changed both their lives. Yes. Marriage didn't magically erase pain. It didn't erase scars. And it certainly didn't make life perfect. But perfection had never been their story. Healing was. Learning was. Growing together was. And that was enough. Some mornings, Elena still woke from nightmares. Afraid Adrian had disappeared again. Some nights, Adrian sat awake beside the window, haunted by memories he never spoke about. But they faced those moments together. Not with grand speeches. Not with impossible promises. But with patience and love. The kind of love that survives storms because it has already survived worse. Years passed, and people noticed changes in Adrian Moretti. He smiled more, laughed more. He spent less time dealing with the remnants of his old empire, and more time helping hospitals, charities, and orphanages. Some people called it redemption. Others called it impossible. But Elena knew the truth. People don't change because they're forced. People change because someone gives them a reason. And Adrian's reason had always been her. Meanwhile, Elena expanded her business. What started as a tiny flower shop became several successful stores. Young women struggling to survive found work through her company. Single mothers found support. Dreams that once seemed impossible slowly became reality. And every success reminded her of something beautiful. She had not been rescued. She had risen. Again, and again, and again, because strength had always lived inside her. Adrian had simply been the person who believed in it before she did. But the greatest miracle of all still waited ahead. And it arrived unexpectedly. On an ordinary Tuesday morning, with a tiny heartbeat, Elena stared at the test, then stared again. Her hands trembled. Tears gathered in her eyes. And for several seconds, she couldn't move. Because after years of believing it might never happen, life had surprised her once more. She was pregnant. And suddenly, memories flooded her heart. Her mother, her childhood, loneliness, the years she spent believing she would always be alone. And now, a family, a real family. By the time Adrian returned home, Elena had cried enough tears for both of them. He immediately grew concerned. What happened? Unable to speak, she handed him the small box. And inside it sat a tiny pair of baby shoes. Silence. Then confusion. Then realization. And suddenly, the feared Adrian Moretti stood completely frozen. For almost 30 seconds, Elena burst into laughter, because the terrifying king of the underworld looked as though reality itself had stopped working. Then his eyes widened, and tears appeared. Real tears. His voice broke. No. He laughed, then cried, then laughed again. No. And before Elena knew it, he had fallen to his knees, hugging her as though she were the most precious thing in existence. Because in many ways, she was. Weeks later, their daughter entered the world. A little girl with Elena's eyes and Adrian's smile. And the moment Adrian held her for the first time, everyone witnessed something unbelievable. The feared Mafia boss cried harder than the baby. And from that day forward, his daughter became the center of his universe. But perhaps no one changed more than Elena. Because motherhood healed pieces of her soul she didn't even know were broken. The little girl who once grew up feeling alone had finally built the family she always dreamed of. And that dream was more beautiful than anything she had imagined. Still, the greatest lesson of her journey had nothing to do with love, or fate, or even happiness. It had everything to do with herself. Years later, Elena sometimes sat outside her flower shop with her daughter sleeping beside her. And on quiet afternoons, memories would return. The struggles, the grief, the heartbreak, the years she spent trying to forget, trying to move on, trying to erase a man she believed she had lost forever. And whenever those thoughts appeared, Adrian would sit beside her. Older now, softer, still handsome, still carrying that calm expression she had fallen in love with all those years ago. Thinking again? He would ask, and Elena would smile, because life had taught her something remarkable. Some people enter life for a season, some for a lesson, and some become part of the soul. Not because love is easy, not because destiny is kind, but because certain hearts recognize each other. Even after years apart, even after pain, even after goodbye. She had tried to forget him. God knows she had tried. But fate had other plans. Because Adrian Moretti had never let go. Not out of obsession, not out of control, but because somewhere deep inside his heart, he had always believed that love deserved one more chance. And perhaps he had been right. Because in the end, Elena Hart didn't become extraordinary because she fell in love with a powerful man. She became extraordinary because she never allowed pain to destroy her kindness. She survived loss. She survived loneliness. She survived heartbreak. And she continued choosing hope. Again and again. And maybe that was the true love story. Not how a mafia boss found the woman of his dreams, but how a gentle girl who once stood alone in the world discovered that after every ending, life still had the courage to begin again. And as the sun disappeared beyond the horizon, Adrian wrapped an arm around his wife, while their daughter slept peacefully beside them. No enemies, no darkness, no fear, just love. Simple, quiet, beautiful. And after everything they had endured, that was more than enough. Because sometimes, the greatest happy endings belong to the people who almost gave up believing in them. And perhaps somewhere, in another lonely heart searching for hope, their story served as a reminder that even after heartbreak, even after loss, even after goodbye, love still has a way of finding its way home. The end.